My name is Ayça Çubukçu. I'm an associate professor in human rights in the Department of Sociology here at the London School of Economics and Political Science. As the convener of the Internationalism, Cosmopolitanism, and the Politics of Solidarity annual lecture series at the LSE, it is my honor to introduce very briefly, as requested by Professor Ross herself, our 11th annual speaker in the series, and to welcome her, as well as you, our audience, both here and online. We have about 140 people online, to LSE and to the virtual world tonight. I mean, I could say so much about Professor Ross's work. You probably know as much as I will be able to convey tonight, but let me introduce her formally as Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at New York University. She retired from NYU about 6 years ago. Professor Ross has also taught at University of California, Santa Cruz, and has held several fellowships, including the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton Fellowship. Okay, how many of you have read books by Professor Ross? Okay, so please bear with me. Professor Ross is the author of several books, including The Emergence of Social Space, Rimbaud and the Paris Commune, which was published in 1988, Fast Cars, Clean Bodies, Decolonization and the Reordering of French Culture, which was published in 1995, May 68 and its Afterlives, which was published in 2002, Communal Luxury, the Political Imaginary of the Paris Commune, which was published in 2015. It's a book that I teach every year here at the LSE in my seminar on internationalism with great pleasure, I must say. Also, The Politics and Poetics of Everyday Life, which was published by Verso, I believe, in 2023. And most recently, The Commune Form, Transformation of Everyday Life, also published by Verso last year. Now, broadly construed, you will each know Professor Ross as perhaps another type of intellectual, but broadly construed, her interests are in French literature, politics, and culture, as well as in urban theory and revolutionary history, which I think accounts for some of what I imagine to be the scholarly and political diversity and crowd we see tonight. So, Professor Ross's lecture tonight is titled The Ecological Face of the Commune Form and is based on her most recent book. Professor Ross will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we will have a very brief conversation about some of the themes in her work, after which we will open up to online questions as well as in-house questions. As you can see, I'm terribly excited, and it's a tremendous pleasure to have and hear from Professor Ross here in London and here at the LSE. Please join me in welcoming her as a scholar, as well as, if I may say, a most inspiring political educator. Professor Ross, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ayça and the LSE community for inviting me here and giving me a chance to reflect a little bit about this recent book, The Commune Form, why I wrote it, where I'm coming from. And I think I begin by saying that I've been interested for some time in the processes of political memory. And the question of when it is that precise moments from the past, from our collective political past, when they become figurable for us in our present day concerns, when do they enter forcefully into our present? It's not something that you can program. You know, people try to do commemorations, and a lot of times commemorations fall completely flat. So the question is, when do these moments resonate sufficiently with our present in order to become fully visible and maybe newly interpretable for us in a meaningful way? Now, it's a bit abstract, but this is the question that has guided my work for several years, and especially my work on political memory of great events in the history of the left, like May 68 or the Paris Commune, which are thought of as French events, but they are indeed events that exceed dramatically any national context. And it was my work on the Paris Commune, in fact, that became the occasion, as I recount in the book, for an invitation to visit an occupation in southwestern France, Notre-Dame-des-Landes. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. If you're not, please, we can talk about it. But what these were occupiers trying to prevent the building of an international airport outside of Nantes. It was an occupation that was actually the longest lasting social movement in post-war French history. It went through many, many phases. But what they wanted from me was a discussion about the continuities and the discontinuities between the experience of urban 19th century communards and what was playing out, or rather what they were actually building themselves in a swampy corner of farmland outside of Nantes. Now, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a political scientist. My background is in literary studies, and I think that because of that, I tend to make my point of departure rarely a concept. I don't start with big concepts. I usually start with scenes of political subjectivization, moments of political awakening. And when I wrote Communal Luxury, for example, I was trying to envision the Paris Commune as a kind of laboratory, really, a laboratory of political invention, what Marx called its working existence. And I wanted to show that the emancipatory processes at work in Paris that spring were really the everyday creations of ordinary people, distinct from any, say, striving for doctrinal purity or consistency. In other words, I wanted to reevaluate the event and its centrifugal effects beyond any simple analysis of historical fact. And to do so involves me in a kind of restaging of the event, one that I hope will alter what we can see of the event and then later what we can possibly say about it. So it's a kind of a mise en scène, a mise en scène of what history has left for us in storage. Now, when I went to Notre-Dame-des-Landes in 2015, this was a very creative moment in the history of the occupation. They had recently, well, in the last couple years previously, they had withstood a full-scale armed invasion by the French state and a siege that lasted for an entire month. And they had weathered that. They had rebuilt all of the destruction from the tanks and what had gone on, rebuilt with the help of more and more supporters from all over the country and beyond who came to help. And so at that point, they were actively looking for models for how to continue, how to inhabit the struggle, how to grow it, how to make it larger. And some of them went to Chiapas. That was a possible model. And others took a voyage back in time and came back to the Paris Commune. These were mostly the occupiers who were convinced of the central role of the aesthetic in any kind of social or individual transformation. So they had been, they went back to the Paris Commune to find a kind of usable archive. And they had been drawn, like me, to the idea that I had focused on of communal luxury. I mean, for me, communal luxury was a sort of central allegory or a prism through which to refract a number of communard processes and ideas. And like me, they were very intrigued by the oxymoronic logic of the idea, communal luxury. Isn't luxury by definition that which is limited to the few? How can you have communal luxury? At the heart of communard thought, communal luxury is a figure for human flourishing beyond material needs, for useful production, equality in abundance, and for luxury not founded on class division. I thought of it too as a kind of bridge to the present and a way to reactivate communard debates about labor, about art in today's political context, in a world that now and only intermittently now is beginning to entertain again, and under the most dire ecological circumstances, the possibility of living better by producing less and by working and consuming and living differently, a life where subsistence becomes abundance because we are not desperately accumulating. And these are all aspects of what I tried to develop in the Commune Form. So I'll talk more about those aspects, but first I want to sketch out the larger historical argument of the book regarding territorial struggles like the ZAD at Notre Dame des Landes, but including a lot of the pipeline struggles in Australia and Americas, and Standing Rock, and various others around the world. And it's clear that these are movements that are important in the way in which they intervene directly against the accelerated capitalist destruction of the lived environment. But I also think that their existence today affects how we view the recent past. They transform our sense of the history of, say, my lifetime, the second half of the 20th century up until now, and especially the 1960s and 70s. How do they do this? Well, how do they reconfigure what counts as the great conflicts of our lifetime? Contemporary ecological struggles that try to preserve the living make visible the links that exist between past situations throughout the world, from Japan to Brazil, from Canada to South Africa, and those of today. Today's ecological preoccupations awaken new echoes, which in their turn give rise to a revised understanding of what counts for us in the recent past, what counts in history at all. I don't really believe that the past enlightens the present. I think it's the present that rearranges our perception of the past and recalls to our memory certain precursor emancipatory episodes, while erasing others that appear all of a sudden to be completely less relevant, less pertinent to our situation, less alive for us today, and ultimately worth forgetting. It's the present that tells us what is worth remembering and what is worth forgetting. So in this book, it's the victory of the ZAD at Notre-Dame-des-Landes that suddenly makes it possible for us to look back and see a movement like the Larzac in southern France. This was a 10-year movement on the part of sheep farmers to block the state's attempt to expropriate their land to use as an army training ground. And once we begin to focus on, when the Larzac comes back into view, then we can look a little bit to another part of the world at exactly the same time, another 10-year struggle on the part of Japanese farmers and paysans to prevent their land from being expropriated to build the Narita airport. And so suddenly it's the whole history of the last half century that becomes reconfigured, thanks to the existence and the form that contemporary ecological struggles are taking. The Luzerath forest in Germany, Standing Rock, Stop Cop City outside of Atlanta. These, thanks to these movements of today, the Larzac and the struggle outside of Tokyo can now appear as they really are, the most characteristic and the most decisive struggles of the 1960s and 70s. The 1960s and 70s then become another name for the moment when defending the conditions of life on the planet became the new horizon of all political struggle. In other words, any movement for social justice from that point on had to be conjugated with another imperative, which was simply to defend the conditions of life on the planet. So contemporary struggles also give new names to what we can now remember about the recent past. And one of those names is the title that I chose for the book, The Commune Form. And I wanted to postulate the existence of a form that gathers together all of these experiences. And when I say form, I'm not talking really about any kind of pre-established or static model, but rather I'm talking about an oppositional process, a kind of working out against a shared enemy that's intensely situational. It doesn't unfold the same way everywhere or throughout time. It's not a concept. It's a kind of distilled elemental principle in all emancipatory projects that flourishes whenever the state withdraws or takes a nap or is distracted, to which we can give the name commune. It's a political movement that is also a collective elaboration of a desired way of life. And I go back to some remarks by Kropotkin and Marx, where they both come to the same amazingly similar one sentence statement. They say, the commune form is the necessary setting for revolution and the means to accomplish it. In other words, it's both the context and the content. And obviously they're talking about the French Revolution, the Paris Commune, but these and even beyond, back to the agricultural agrarian communes in Russia and elsewhere in the 19th century. It's an archaic form, but one that announces itself as a form of future community. So in order to specify the form, as a historian, I looked to history. And the book is in many ways an exercise in resituating the various iterations and instances of the commune form across a number of examples. And that's because resituating, because the commune form is always situated. It can never, it's not abstract. It can't be abstract. It's built, and it's about building and creating spaces in the most literal sense of the term. Now, I thought it might be helpful to get at the specificity of the form by making a few comparative remarks with, say, the traditional workers' movement. And the first thing that we notice right away is that the new conflictuality of these movements, citizen ecological organizations, say, they don't have the force that historically workers' unions had to control the dynamics of the struggle. Rather than jealously guarding the purity of the initial opposition between workers and management, for example, these kinds of territorial struggles, in a way that I'll develop a little later, and perhaps counterintuitively, are very porous. They open out to surrounding struggles, to surrounding populations, and invite them in. They invite adjoining struggles to join in. There's always an expansive movement towards federating with other struggles. The second remark is that these are often, as in the examples I've given already, what the Maoists used to call protracted wars. These are movements of long duration, and in part that's because they are in control of the means of subsistence often, because a lot of these movements are rural. But in part, they don't have to contend with salary loss, like in a long strike, for example, or they don't have to contend with retaliatory firings or some of the things that would go on in classical workers' struggles. And this is why the confrontation is directly with the state and the violence of the state, as we see in something like Stop Cop City or what occurred in Saint-Soline in France. The third point would be that in their opposition to capitalist development and infrastructure, they're engaged with the materiality of the repercussions of development, while the workers' movement ordinarily is about wages or about targeting money form, and rarely with the content of the experience of work itself. So, fourth, from the perspective of the workers' movement, often these territorial struggles have been discredited as a kind of NIMBYism, or as the insinuation that these are middle-class movements. But I think anyone who has recently been to Chicago, Cleveland, or especially Detroit, and seen the entire development of these amazing community urban gardens in largely African American communities, would have to recognize that this is now very common in popular neighborhoods, to find these kinds of mobilizations and organizations that are taking place outside of any kind of party and outside of any kind of union. It starts out as, neighborhood thing, direct knowledge of the territory, and then by extending that orientation, it ends up being a resistance to capitalist extension. So while it's true that this new conflictuality is decentered in relation to the heart of capitalist valorization, work, industries, corporations. It's opposed to capitalist extension, the kind that takes the form of cutting down forests to turn them into police training grounds, or destroying agricultural land to make redundant throughways. And these are movements that are grounded in what it means to inhabit, which is something that touches directly onto everyday life. And there, where the feeling of dispossession is perhaps more vital and more violent than feelings brought on by, say, exploitation or by the thwarting of being able to recuperate a greater part of surplus value. Now, I want to turn now to some of the practices that I discuss in the book that, for me, make up the political intelligence of the Commune Form. And the first is defense. I started out with the question, why does defense generate more solidarity than resistance? Why do movements of defense create a broader and stronger sense of solidarity than resistance? And I think it's because that when we resist, we're letting the state set the agenda. But when we defend, we start with our own agenda. We start with something that we love, or something that we cherish, or that we want to protect. And that's already a different kind of temporality than letting the state temporality prevail. So you may begin by defending, say, a part of an area of unpolluted land, or a neighborhood. But defending the territory over time comes to include defending the collective life project that develops through the defense. Or, in other words, we make our community by defending it. It's a creation. The second of these practices, appropriation, got me back to a number of thinkers from the 70s, anti-productivist thinkers like Maria Mies, Andre Gorz, Félix Guattari, but especially Henri Lefebvre, who's been important to my work for a long time. But he's not really often recognized as the ecological thinker that he actually was. And it's Lefebvre who thought the creation of what he called appropriated spaces. And these are spaces where desires and relations that are not reducible to economic imperatives have the freedom to flourish. And I come back again and again to Lefebvre's amazing insight that, quite simply, groups and individuals cannot constitute themselves as political subjects, as actors in their own lives, if they don't produce a space. And the space is both physical and social. A space that they create and appropriate for themselves. And this is really probably the best definition I can give for the Commune Form. It's a collective reappropriation of a space, and by extension, a temporality, not in the sense of possession, but in the sense of creation, of an oeuvre, almost like a work of art. Lefebvre went so far as to say that groups classes, even fractions of classes, can't recognize each other as subjects unless they generate and create a space. So already you can see that this idea of appropriation is far more exigent than a mere idea or a theory. It's existential. It presupposes actually living differently, actually changing the way that you live. And the last one of these practices that I want to talk about, I thought it was important in a lecture that has to do with the politics of solidarity, that I emphasize the whole question of who are these people? Who are these people who are engaged in living differently, who are producing a space that they collectively manage or create? Well, they are not a political party. They're not a social class. The Commune Form is much more inclusive, say, than a factory, since it includes the elderly, the unemployed, animals, other species. The answer is what the occupiers at the ZOD called composition. And composition is the creation of a polemical political community. It's the production of a new people that is different from the people that are seen and counted by the state. Composition is a pragmatic response to the phenomena that Henri Lefebvre noticed already back in the 1970s, which the fact that ecological and spatial combats necessarily create the strangest of alliances. They create alliances between very, very diverse people. Battles over land draw lines of solidarity differently than battles over ideas. When I went to these endless general assemblies at Notre-Dame-des-Landes, I just could never get over the different kinds of people that were there, living, sharing a territory and sharing these kinds of discussions that went on forever. You had the old farmers, the old dairy farmers who had refused to sell their land and got everything started. You had more modern farmers, you had lesbian separatist farmers who didn't believe in animal protein right next to the dairy farmers. You had nuns, lawyers, community figures, elected officials, Black Bloc. You had naturalists who didn't even believe in agriculture of any kind. All of these people working over time to produce a kind of solidarity across extreme diversity. And I think this is quite new. I think this is born in movements and occupations like the ZOD, and it represents a massive investment in organizing life in common without the exclusions in the name of identity or in the name of ideology that are so common in the history of the left, and its frequent fracturing and sectarianism. So what composition of this kind shows is that it's not only possible, but it's actually quite desirable to work with and ally with people with radically different political codes and ways of expressing themselves, insofar as the enemy is clearly designated, and insofar as solidarity extends towards all the different groups that have made this kind of commitment to working, that equality is presumed in a kind of Rancierian sense by those who decide to act together. Equality as the animating presupposition is what creates a polemical political community. And, you know, looking back, I think the best factor, the best aspect of composition is that it works. It actually works quite pragmatically. And the reason why, for example, the ZOD succeeded in the long airport battle is because with so many elements acting completely differently with different methods, but in solidarity, it was very complicated for the state to deal with this. They couldn't, you had the older farmers who had an enormous amount of social legitimacy, who could organize blockades with their tractors and do all the things that, you know, traditionally happens in the countryside in France. You had the scientific knowledge of the naturalists who were cataloging endangered species. You had the practical experience of squats and direct action that the anarchists brought. You had all of the legal delays that were extremely important over time, that the people with real legal knowledge and skill were able to work in the courts doing that. And all of this with the tacit understanding that no one tried to think that their method was the best. You know, all of you know, all the methods were, you know, the improvisational unpredictability of the punks, the you know, the direct action of people who were very willing to have frontal violent battles with the cops. All of this combined to form an endlessly changing offensive that was very difficult for authorities to conquer easily or to pacify or to recuperate. And a lot of people, there's some people say, well, I don't want to call it a united front, it's too military. And so a lot of people think about composition in a musical sense, like a symphony where at certain time the horns are very loud and the violins recede, or, you know, but it's constantly changing, and the groups allow this to happen. I think that I wanted to write a short book, one that could be read in one sitting. And I think I succeeded. And the reason is that when it comes to trying to think about capitalism's destruction of the environment, we already know everything. We've known everything since maybe 1962, when Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, came out. Maybe we've known everything since the 1920s and 30s with Jacques Ellul and people like that writing back then. It's possible that we've known everything since the late 19th century, when Kropotkin and Élisée Reclus and other communards sat in the Jura Mountains after the Paris Commune and thought about what had occurred in a kind of proto ecological way. They didn't even have the word then, but certainly they understood that. So if we already know everything, there's really no use in continuing to predict catastrophes or even to gather data or to repeat prophecies, which will undoubtedly become fulfilled, that everything has become too complex for us to intervene in directly. I think that what the ZAD at Notre-Dame-des-Landes and another more recent victory that's I can go into during the discussion, what the ZAD showed us is that it is very possible to seize hold of the machine and throw it into reverse. And the movement that emerged from the experience of the ZAD, Soulèvement de la Terre, uprisings of the earth, is at this very moment establishing a set of priorities and passing openly into the offensive against the seizing and sacking of land in France. So I just want to conclude the book this way, and I want to conclude this talk this way with just a few remarks about Soulèvement de la Terre, because I think it's a movement that shows, that has in a way solved the problem of how practices that are rooted in struggles in specific particular circumstances and places can be brought together to form something like a global ambition. Soulèvement sees its task as, quote, linking up the land of the paysan with the planet of the ecologists. And in practice, what this means is they go around and they amplify different local struggles that are very specific and grounded in what they share in common is that they're against any kind of the agro-industrial pollution, land hoarding, developers. And they were made up out of a kind of a composition between autonomists from the ZAD with young climate activists who had gotten really frustrated after COVID and after the big marches, the pre-COVID big marches in the capital cities that sort of went nowhere. And then also farmers, paysan unions. Those were the three groups that got together to form Soulèvement de la Terre. And their main idea was that the problem was that the climate movement was too abstract. Save the climate was too abstract of a slogan, because it had to be brought down to earth, and it had to be brought down to specific portions of the earth and the places where some real work could be done. It's a movement that anyone can join. It's not a class, it's not a party, it's not generational, but it is highly organized. And this is what's interesting. It's public, it's popular, and it's organized. And it's the form, again, that interests me, because I see it as evoking a kind of variation, once again, of the archaic form of the commune, reworked and made available to use against the new social and ecological conditions of the present. And if you go back to what I mean by that is that if you go back to the medieval communes, say in medieval Europe, these were highly chauvinistic kinds of organizations. They were concerned with, you know, defending their commune against rival communes in the area. But the new mode is that the various regional struggles now find themselves federated by the actions of soulèvement. So actions that are based on specific milieu, on the specific needs of the people and the life forms that live there, are now federated into a kind of a broader structure. And this means that they solved the biggest problem that confronted the 19th century communards. You know, in Paris, their isolation was so great that they couldn't even get a message. Even they were using messenger pigeons, is that what they're called? To try to send messages to adjoining communes that were taking place in Marseille or Saint-Étienne or Lyon. And that didn't, you know, there was absolutely, they were completely cut off by what Marx called a Chinese wall of lies from the rest of the country. And so when the survivors of the commune go up and try to take stock of what happened and what had really gone down, this was the main problem that they confronted. How did that happen? How did they become so isolated? How were they not able to make any kind of contact with any potential allies in the countryside or in these other adjoining cities? So so when I see what an organization like Soulèvement de la Terre is doing in the way of bringing together these local struggles into creating an orientation or a common horizon of situated struggles. I think I'll stop there with that phrase. A common horizon of situated struggles.
Thank you.
Sure.
Maybe we share your microphone. Oh, is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you so much for a extremely rich book and talk. I feel like we could sit and talk for days, as in that assembly here, as in the assemblies you participated with Zad. I have a ton of questions and comments. I'll limit myself to 2 points. One about solidarity and one about leadership. So you quote in the book, well, you say both Marx and Kropotkin thought that revolution is indistinguishable from the direct democracy of the commune form. So really, my 2 questions are about this commune form and its direct democracy. One is about leadership, because in the book, you draw a sharp contrast between territorial struggles like ZAD, which are characterized, you say, by extreme diversity. Extreme diversity is the term you use. And then you note their ZAD's difference from territorial struggles in Standing Rock. You contrast it at some point to the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And you remark that the commune form, at least as much as you witnessed it through ZAD, is neither ideological nor identitarian. So what then is the logic of composition if it's neither based on identity nor on ideology, I understand the form, but is the content of composition free-floating? Is there no substance then to this? The reason I ask this question is because I'm not convinced 100% that the Black Panther Party or Standing Rock didn't have to articulate a compositional logic either, even though from the outside it seems like they're indigenous-led in the case of Standing Rock or led by the Black community. There must have been still a logic of articulation in the language of Black Lion Move within those communities as well. So what distinguishes, for the sake of simplicity, an identitarian struggle, or what appears to you to be an identitarian struggle, like the Black Panther Party for self-defense, which was also in Oakland and elsewhere place-based, yet perhaps more identitarian within the schematic distinction. So I just wanted to open up that contrast, contrasting logics of composition. And I thought we might go into a bit more detail about that. And then I'll ask my question about direct democracy and leadership.
Well, yeah, the difference between, say, let's take Standing Rock and the Zod. Standing Rock was indigenous led. In any kind of settler areas, countries, parts of the world that have suffered settler colonialism, the entire relationship to a land-based struggle is very different than, say, in Europe, which is why a kind of pure composition of the kind I'm talking about, and non-identitarian composition, is much easier in a movement like the one that's taking place in northern Italy right now, trying to block the construction of a high-speed railway through the Alps from Turin to Lyon, when there already is a high speed. All these movements are always redundant. You know, there is already a high speed movement, a train between Lyon and Turin, which is half empty most of the time, and yet they want to build another one. So the opposition to that is based on the people that live in the valley, the Val di Susa in Italy. And so in that sense, it's really about, in effect, their land. Now in a settler, you know, in a settler colonial situation like the Americas, or, you know, you have to conjugate any of these movements and battles over land through the horrible history of the indigenous people's relationship to their land, right? So that's the big difference. And I would say too, the Black Panther example is tricky. You know, I mean that's harder, but I still think that. You know, it was a neighborhood organization, but and eventually the Black Panthers themselves began to federate and ally with Puerto Ricans and with other, you know, Chicanos and other you know movements in the area. But you know, they really did begin by proclaiming the value of Black neighborhoods, and Blackness itself. So it does really start in a kind of more identitarian way.
Another distinguishing characteristic you note in movements like Zad that that sort of exemplify the commune form today is, you say, unlike a party, and this point I appreciate very much, there's no need for a vanguard party, and there is no single group that is in leadership. But when you contrast it to the, again, territory-based struggles in Standing Rock, you say the indigenous elders were clearly in the leadership of this territorial struggle. So it made me wonder, how do you evaluate Standing Rock's established leadership, which may seem, I mean, I don't think identitarian does it justice, but as you say, it's a different territorial, it's a relationship of indigeneity. In those cases, would you make an exception to what you seem to be celebrating in the commune form as happening in ZAD, for example? It's the fact that there is no singular leadership, and it's a broad coalition without a leader.
I think, it's a question of degree, because I wasn't around during Standing Rock. I didn't spend time there. So, and I do think with these kinds of movements, it's really a necessity to do that. But from what I've read, even though the elders, the indigenous elders were in a kind of making the decisions, let's say, this did not prevent a form of real solidarity to develop with people coming from all over the US and, including actresses and, again, very, very different kinds of people who made their way to the Dakotas in the middle of the winter to stand with them. And so that's certainly a deep form of solidarity. But because of a kind of a structure where it was the indigenous people who were making the decisions, that caused a lot of existential change on the part, say, of white ecologists who showed up in solidarity. I mean, they didn't have the same kind of status, let's say, that they might in other movements.
Oh, I see what you mean. They were.
I mean, they had.
Centered.
They were decentered. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Just one final thing. This came up in our class discussion of the Paris Commune. It's a line from Kropotkin that you repeat, a thought from Kropotkin, and you say, quoting Kropotkin, that solidarity is not an ethics, it's not a moral sentiment, I'm not quoting precisely, but a revolutionary strategy. Since the phrase from Kropotkin comes up twice, both in the commune form, and you don't quite explain what you mean by saying solidarity is not an ethics. And since I have you here, I thought I would raise the question here and then open it up to the audience. Thank you.
I think what he meant by that was it's not a sentiment. I think that's, he said, solidarity is not a feeling, it's not a sentiment, it's a strategy. And it's the most important of the revolutionary strategies. That without it, there's nothing, so it's not about a kind of sentimental human feeling for other humans, or it's not at that level. It's at a much more thoughtful, and again, existential level where you actually have to change. Like the white ecologists at Standing Rock, they have to decenter themselves, right? But that is part of the activity of building solidarity. So, which is, I should say, I'm sometimes accused of being sentimental myself about when I talk about composition, and especially among people who have lived it and who say to me, it's hell. And it is, I mean, can you imagine trying to not only share a movement, but a living space over years with different kinds of people. That's how difficult it is. It's very, very, very hard.
Yes. Thank you very much. I should mention the encampment that we had here at the LSE. Reading the Commune Form, it was impossible for me not to think of the encampment or the liberated zone, as our students call it, for Palestine. That was just happening couple buildings down. Again, I have a lot to say, but very happily I open it to the audience. Oh my God. Okay. Maybe we take four, two here, a short response, then I'll turn to the backs. Thank you. Yes. May or? Sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Do you mind?
Yes. I can project.
Yes?
Yeah.
We have online.
Wow, that's very sophisticated. Is it like, it's working now?
Yes.
Thank you so much for this. It was such a pleasure to hear you speak after having read your work. So thanks for coming. I have so many questions, but I'll just try to frame them in quick 2 comments. One is common question. One is, I was wondering whether the juxtaposition of the Commune Form against labor struggles is a fair juxtaposition, precisely because many labor struggles, and I really appreciate the kind of non-productivist focus, which has always been the focus of the left, and I think a lot of feminists have done a lot of work on this, and that's great. But also the strike has historically done a lot of that work as well. So historically, workers went on strike against colonialism, against conditions in housing conditions in working class neighborhoods, against healthcare issues. So the labor strike has done also that work. So I'm wondering whether the juxtaposition as the new kind of better version of the old forms of struggle is maybe a fair way to say that, even if we have a critique of obviously the trade union movement and all of that, but the extent to which we can think about the trade union movement as something that also infiltrates the kind of social life beyond the workplace. And the other question I had was, especially after having read the book, is it's such a nice story on some level, but as you just mentioned, it's so difficult. And I'm wondering what kind of critique can come out of that movement. Particularly, I'm thinking in terms of relations of property, how tensions around the reclaiming space versus the idea around ownership can come up, specifically with the farmers. Another also important thing that came up was, which is the question of race and migration in France right now. A very different situation, for example, than the Paris Commune, when France looked very different than what it does now. And I think this relates to the question of solidarity and how they actually move from this very kind of localized space into an internationalist sensibility in the way they operate.
Thank you very much, Ayça, and thank you very much, Professor Ross, for this interesting talk. I guess I wondered if, because the question I had, I suppose, was partially also what you were getting at, Ayça, in your first remark. So I wondered if I could push a little bit further on that differentiation between composition and identitarian struggles, because I was going to ask exactly about the encampments, right? So the common horizon of situated struggles, I was thinking of the campus, the encampments of the last 18 months or so as exactly that, common horizon of situated struggles. And as I was also going to say, as somebody who's spent a fair bit of time with Soulèvement de la Terre, including in their struggles against the privatization and enclosure of water, and exactly in the encampment against that tunnel, the train line being built between France and Italy. They are absolutely organized, extremely organized, And it is a coalition, but at the same time with Soulève Mandelater, there is very clearly a leadership. And I wonder if that is because you see that, and I've spent quite a lot of time with them. So you see after a while that there is a group of 4 to 6 people who are the leaders of that. And that is, I think, where they are vulnerable also in terms of state repression and in terms of policing and in terms of them having having had the state trying to deregister them, right? So trying to literally ban them, which was in the end unsuccessful, thankfully. But about the encampments, like the Black Panther struggle, like the indigenous struggle, I think the anti-pipeline struggles, I think that the Black Panthers were very clearly also anti-capitalist. They weren't identitarian in the sense of we are just here for us and for our people and our rights and our etc. They were anti-capitalist also, and on the understanding that their liberation, all our liberations are bound up together, and the common enemy, as it were, is capitalism. And I think that with the encampments for Palestine, we've also seen in the last 18 months is a real realization. For example, now you have the energy embargo for Palestine, you have the climate movement for Palestine, you have the queers for Palestine, you have gays for Gaza, whatever. You have an enormous acceleration in the political learning that people have been doing about the interconnection of Palestine isn't about those people just about those people living on that piece of land being genocided at the moment. It is about all of us at the end of the day. And I wonder if that distinction then between composition and identitarian struggle still holds.
Okay, I promise 2 from the front, and then I'll turn to the back after an initial answer from Professor Ross. Yes. Emma? Yes.
Oh, I have to keep it present. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Your framework reminded me of 2 authors and 2 concepts. One is Chantal Mouffe's agonistic pluralism. And I was just wondering, and I used this concept as well when I wrote a piece on the public parks, popular forums that were formed after the Gezi protests in Turkey. So I wonder if you have engaged with that, because it's like, it is plurality and struggle, and I mean, they don't need to be really resemble each other, but they have a common aversion towards a common kind of aversion to a common enemy. I mean, and the other is more recent. I'm sure you're familiar with Bruno Latour's latest book as well, and he talks about ecological class, that we need to form a new class, and that's his latest book before he passed away. I was like, it's not just anymore these classical concepts of class, like working class, bourgeois class, but we need to form an ecological class, because this is a real problem of our time. So our time, the present time, needs to come up with a different concept of class, which is the ecological class, which kind of, again, this plurality, but struggling for climate ecology, So these 2 concepts, this all reminded. Thank you.
I'll be brief. No lecture. It's a question about alienation, which you didn't talk about, but it's in your book. For Marx, it's about labor. For Lefebvre, it's about place and alienation from land. But ecological thinkers have also pointed out other dimensions of alienation, psychic alienation of kind of mind-body bifurcation, human supremacist alienation from all non-human life. So I'm just curious how you think the commune form helps us to address all those different dimensions of alienation.
I'll start with the last one first, because it's something that I've thought about a lot, and part of the reason I gravitate to someone like Lefebvre is that and some of the other thinkers from the 70s is that they get at ecological thinking through the question of everyday life. And for Lefebvre, that's where alienation is grounded now. It's no longer, necessarily about direct economic forms of alienation, although ultimately it all goes back to that. Like I'm enough of a Marxist to think that ultimately it goes back, but what Lefebvre did was to open up the whole idea of alienation to talk about different kinds of dispossession that we suffer from that are not obviously economic, dispossession of our time, dispossession of our desires, dispossession of aesthetic pleasure, dispossession of, just the general crapification of the world now, that the kinds of dispossession that leads to. So he reworked the entire theory of contemporary alienation through questions of just expanding the forms of dispossession that we feel. And a lot of it is related to questions of inhabiting, like how can we inhabit various, where we live? How can that be? So I think alienation around everyday life is at the center of what I'm trying to talk about in the Commune Form, and because it's concerned with questions of habitation and inhabiting, it deals with it right away. It doesn't go directly through labor, say. For your question, I'm embarrassed to say I have never read either Chantal Mouffe or Bruno Latour. I avoided Bruno Latour for a reason. And it had to do with just the people that were reading him that I knew. You know how that works sometimes. And I couldn't take, and he was, it may have been a caricature of him, but he was so frequently held up as being the non-Marxist, and I think I think that's thing theory and all this. Oh God, I couldn't do it. You're brave. That's all I can say. And these questions are I think as far as I think you're right. A lot of what I said about just the easy contrast I was making with the labor movement, I just wanted to sort of be very broad there. And obviously the whole history of factory occupations is where we get everything, right? But I was struck by, I use this example in the book, the big two movements, the 10-year movements in France of the 70s was the Larzac on the one hand, but also LEAP. And LEAP was the last of the big factory occupations. And the two movements were contemporaneous, and it's fascinating to put them against each other because they were the French left for all of that time. That's where everybody was in solidarity with both movements equally. But there is a way in which you can suggest that the factory occupation somewhat comes to an end with LEAP. I mean, it doesn't really, because I think it's still going on to our day. But it loses, it's like the ending of a particular kind of political sequence, whereas the Larzac is more of an opening up of something new. But I think I think basically you're right that that the labor struggle is not only about wages, and there are often much bigger dimensions and to it. I didn't mean to say that this is now new and better in any way. And then the question of, I'm fascinated by appropriation. I don't know about it as a critique, but certainly I think any of these experiments with different forms of social possession, other than, you know, actual ownership, are, I think it's what we should be doing, you know? I mean, it's really, it's like during the Paris Commune, all of the bourgeois had fled to the Versailles, and they had left all their apartments and their atelier open, right, empty. So the commune began to appropriate these spaces, and when they did so, it wasn't as though they owned them. It was that those spaces were simply too valuable to the community at large to be left empty and unused. So that would be the logic of that kind of experimenting with new kinds of social possession. As far as the campus encampments, I think yes, absolutely. This is the complete new example of something like the Commune Form, definitely. As for leadership of at Soulèvement, yes and no, you know. What happens with the general leadership of the people that we're thinking of, they are invariably, though, working with groups and communities. I'm thinking like merci, non, bassin, les bassines, you know, that whole energy came from below. I mean, and that came from a whole different group of people that they then sort of merge with. And you could call that a kind of leadership, but I'm not so sure, because in the end, a figure like Julien, for example, is really central. And you would say if you're looking around for a leader figure, he would be it, and not part of not the others who are more, you know, managing to, you know, coordinate these other instances. It's complicated, but I don't think that, I still don't think that there's like exactly a vanguard of I find it very interesting the way they work with an existing, you know, problem that's been confronted by the people in the neighborhood, that, and then they essentially, what Soulèvement does is amplify it, just bring it to the national level and even beyond.
So what I'll do is I'll collect the remaining questions and hope for a communal answer in the last couple of minutes or so. 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's it. And then hopefully Professor Ross will be able to not abstract from them all, because the communal form is the opposite of abstraction. Yes, please. Yes.
Yes, I think it's working. My question gonna be brief. I am gonna ask regarding the internationalism, then your observation, and that I'm working on international solidarity with Rojava, with the Kurdish movement, that your talk fully resonated, and I observed certain parts also in that case too. My question is that the forms that you observed and you analyzed have kind of a new inspiration or source of inspiration for a sort of new future internationalism. It seems that still they are very localized, definitely attract a diverse group of people, but still stays in the kind of a national level. So do you think that they have the potential to attract from someone in the Latin America to join the struggle in the airport, a kind of a struggle against the airport in France, for example? Do you think that they have those potential, or they need to be some sort of a national self-determination kind of a question that always attracts internationalism.
There was a question. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. My question is also really brief. I just be interested to hear what, if any, thoughts you have on the kind of like inversion of this commune form, which is like the sort of crypto succession kind of thing, like people who are buying or buying cruise ships, or sort of El Salvador, like having their sort of the zone, as Quinn Slobodian calls it. And yeah, what if any way, how, if at all, it sort of resonates with your understanding of the commune form?
How what resonates?
These kind of like basically right-wing crypto nationalist or crypto fascist attempts to succeed from the global economy, essentially.
Thank you. And John?
Hi, thanks so much for this very inspiring and exciting talk. I wish I'd read the book, and I haven't, and I'm going to go away and read it. But there's so much that I think is really fundamental and important and interesting, and especially, beginning from a point where you rework a relationship to nature or to the economy, quote unquote, and then you sort of build I don't know, in my language, I can't help thinking of it as a kind of a sphere of autonomy. But then, my question then, just one small question, the relationship between that kind of autonomous spatial form, the kind of hot local place of belonging, and then the shift to federation and the question of soulèvement de la terre and how that might operate. There's so many dimensions, of course, the questions that are brought in about, leadership, ideology, identity, and all these kinds of things. But just one element of it. What was so interesting, I thought, about the beginning of your talk is you presented it, about temporality, and you were being asked by the commune to sort of situate it within this temporality around the commune form. And so you have a role there that's a sort of organic relationship to the autonomous form of the commune, and they're making a demand of you. Presumably there's some reciprocity. Could you just, is there, in that relationship between the positioned, engaged intellectual and the transition, as it were, from the autonomous local space to the broader federated space, is it possible to reflect a little bit on your positionality, within that? Is there a role there, as it were, for the positioned, I don't want to say organic intellectual, but maybe I should, in that kind of relationship, the shift from the autonomous form to the wider, you said global ambition, and, I get the David Harvey resonance, but is there a way to reflect on your role? And even because the wider issues of, say, temporality, but lots of questions about identity and ideology then do come up in that very exciting and interesting transition moment.
Thank you, John. And our final question, and then since we started 4 minutes late, Professor Ross will have 4 minutes to respond. Yeah.
We discussed state repression on a day in which one of the leading occupiers in the Colombia Palestinian resistance has flown to Louisiana to an immigration prison pursuant to his deporting back to Syria, I believe. In Britain, some Stop Oil resistors were jailed 4 years recently, including a 78-year-old woman who was briefly paroled over Christmas because she had cancer. But because she had cancer, her security band kept falling off her wrist, so she was put back in prison over Christmas. I can't imagine how any of the activities we've discussed today can withstand either the Trump government or the Starmer government at present.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that sobering question.
On the new internationalism, on the internationalism question, I don't think the idea would be to have Latin Americans come in and join the movement at Notre Dame des Landes. I think the whole idea is to create a kind of awareness of or let's say, a resonance between something like Notre-Dame-des-Landes and then whatever is being, you know, for example, the entire very successful movement that took place in Valparaiso in Chile, where they had a coalition between urbanists, students, and artists that managed to protect the entire harbor, which was going to be a working harbor that was going to be turned into a giant mall by the government. And once again, it was about a 10-year struggle, but they won. So it's really about, you know, working in your, you know, it's not, and out of that, in the reverberations between these local situations comes a kind of new internationalism, I would say. Okay, right wing, you're talking about a sort of right wing commune form. There's no such thing. Yeah, I mean, you know, people in the United States, people always refer to Waco or, you know, what's the other one? I mean, maybe they're not familiar examples over here, but you know, there's constantly these things where these guys go and, you know, they form a sort of like ultra patriarchal, you know, it has nothing to do with sharing the land or anything like that. And so there's simply no relationship, even though there's a kind of secessionary movement, it's just not the same thing at all.
The role of the intellectual.
Well, what happened to me was that I decided to, when I went there, I thought, okay, so what can I do? You know, I'm not going to stay. I had a job. I had to get, you know, I lived in another country, you know, all those things. So I thought, okay, what can I do? Translation. And I did. I translated their book. A book written by a collective of the occupiers. So, and that was, I did that out of a real need to participate, but to participate in some way that was just made sense for me, you know. I wasn't going to be able to stay and take care of the cows.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, or I don't know, work here. I mean, but that's why the campus occupations are our best example. Yeah.
And about repression, our last question, comment.
I don't know what to say about that. I just don't start from that.
The microphone.
I don't start from the point of view of repression. It doesn't get me anywhere. But you're right. Things of the ambient cynicism and horror of today is pretty unimaginable, and the kinds of violence that people like the people in Soulèvement have confronted in France. And but what can you do? You know, you have to keep going.
Yes, la lucha sigue. On that note, thank you very much, Professor Ross, for your talk, for being with us, for thinking with us, and thank you all for coming. Thanks.